Captains and crews. Before 1533, the admirals most probably resided in Gallipoli, the site of the arsenal and the chief town in their Sanjak. From the appointment of Captain Barbossa in 1533, they resided in Galata, the old Genoese town of Pera, and the site of the imperial arsenal, where they had jurisdiction, it seems, not only over the arsenal itself, but over the surrounding urban area as well. Under the admiral were the commissioner, Emin, and warden, Cathuda, of the arsenal. The commissioner was responsible for financial control and administration, with departmental clerks working under his supervision. The warden was the representative of the galley skippers and crews, and commanded a detachment of galleys when the fleet was at sea. Both posts presumably date from the mid-15th century, when Mehmed II took over and extended the Genoese dockyards, and both lasted into the 17th. The normal route to the wardenship was, it seems, to have served as a galley skipper in the arsenal at Galata. The skippers of the galleys and other vessels in the imperial fleet were resident near the main arsenals at Gallipoli and Galata, each with a detachment of men known as Ozybs and his following. These detachments, it seems, represented the crews of individual ships. The first record of them to survive comes from Gallipoli in 1474, but they had presumably been in existence for much longer. They survived until the late 17th century, when galleons finally displaced galleys as the main fighting vessels in the Ottoman fleet. Within these groups of Ozybs, those with the senior position below the skipper had the title sailor, Yelkenji, or chamber head, Oda, Bashi, and it tended to be these men who received a post as skipper when one fell vacant. What the rather laconic records do not, however, make clear is how the government recruited Ozybs, or what their duties were. A command to the admiral in 1572 orders him to recruit 342 Ozybs, according to custom and law, and to enroll them from among men who were capable of combat and war, allocating their pay and sending the register of their names and salaries to the palace. 52 What the decree might be describing is a levy of young men in the provinces, similar to the levy of Azab infantrymen to the army. If this is the case, it is unlikely that the Ozybs would be seamen by background, but rather would learn the trade through service on the ships, in such functions as overseer of oarsmen or helmsmen. They also, it seems, carried weapons and, by the second half of the 16th century, were equipped with arquebuses. Although each skipper and his detachment of Ozybs seems, in principle, to represent the crew of a single vessel, such records as exist seem to show that there were usually more detachments than there were ships. There were 93 detachments in Gallipoli in 1518-53, and it is unlikely that the dockyard had the capacity for this number of vessels. At Galata in 1571 there were 227 detachments, again probably rather more detachments than there were ships. In the same year, there were an additional 150 skippers without a detachment and apos, that is skippers who did not command a group of Ozybs, but were in line to receive a command when there was a vacancy. 54 The same organization continued into the 17th century. By this time, there were 440 detachments, including 34 at Gallipoli. In addition, there were, in 1604, 56 captains without a detachment. 55 By this time, there were obviously more detachments than ships. If the numbers of detachments increased in the 17th century, there was a decrease in the number of Ozybs in each one. In Gallipoli in 1518, detachments were small, consisting usually of a skipper and 3 Ozybs. A document of 1571, however, suggests that, by this time, there should be 12 Ozybs in each of the 200 ships. 56 In the 17th century, the number of Ozybs in each detachment began to fall again. The number of skippers without a detachment and apos also fell from 56 in 1604 to 30 in 1608. 57 This suggests that an Azab detachment no longer represented the crew of a single galley or other vessel, as it evidently had done in the 16th century, but rather, that the admiral simply began to distribute existing Ozybs between existing skippers, regardless of whether they would serve under them at sea, and to save money by reducing their total numbers. Throughout the age of galleys, therefore, skippers typically rose from the ranks of Ozybs, receiving their promotion to command a vessel on the recommendation of the admiral, the warden of the arsenal, or of any of the fleet commanders. In addition, the sultan sometimes appointed Muslim corsairs as galley skippers or, since seamanship is an international trade, foreigners, the motive power for the ships came from sails and oars, and the men who tended these made up the majority of a galley's crew, with a standard galley requiring, according to Khatib Chalabi, about 150 oarsmen and 20 riggers. 58 Both groups of men came from annual levies. A document of the 1530s records a levy of 57 riggers from Ses, Me on the Aegean coast of Turkey. 59 from 1604, and probably earlier, a specified district in the Sanjak of Gallipoli provided riggers, at a notional rate of 1 rigger for every 7 households, the actual number varying according to demand. The arsenal could also, in case of need, hire riggers for a season. 60. Tending the rigging and sails of a ship was a nautical skill, and the few records which survive suggest that the government levied riggers from coastal areas, presumably from among men with some knowledge of ships, to serve as an oarsman. However, the government regarded the only qualifications as health and strength, and called up most oarsmen from inland areas of Rumelia and Anatolia. In the mid-16th century, some Europeans did comment on the inefficiency of Ottoman oarsmen, but, given the numbers required, in 1539, for example, there were 53,861 oarsmen in a fleet of about 150 ships. It was clearly not practical to seek out experienced men. According to Khatib Chelebi, the practice of forcibly levying oarsmen for the fleet began in 1501. 62. However, the partial survival of a record showing a levy in 1499 to 1500 shows that he is not wholly accurate. 63. It is difficult, too, to imagine how Mehmed II could have manned his ships, in particular the enormous fleet that attacked Negroponte in 1470, without the forcible impressment of oarsmen. It is quite possible, however, that the levy did not become a regular event until the Venetian War of 1499 to 1503. The first extensive documentary evidence appears in the mid-16th century. This reveals that it was the treasury that managed the levy service, on the galleys being essentially a form of taxation. About 3 months before the fleet was due to sail, decrees went out to judges in the areas which were to provide the oarsmen. If necessary, further urgent commands could follow, ordering the governors general and Sanjak governors to assist the judges. The principles of the levy were the same as those that applied to the recruitment of Azov infantrymen. The judge divided his judicial district into quarters, villages, hamlets or communities, and, within these divisions, a specified number of households had to produce an oarsman. Some time after 1541, Lutfi Pasha wrote that 1 in every 4 households had to send an oarsman, selected from the strong young men. 64. In fact, the ratio varied according to the size of the fleet and the size of the area where the government made the levy. For example, in 1551, before the Tripoli campaign, the treasury levied 1 oarsman per 23 households. In 1570-71, for the invasion of Cyprus, the rate was 1 in 15 households. In the next year, after the catastrophe at Lepanto, it was 1 in 7 or 8. 65. The oarsmen did receive pay, but the households within each group that did not provide the man had to provide the cash to cover his wages for 1 month. The rate was 106 akshas for Muslims and 80 akshas for non-Muslims. 66. Galley service was obviously not popular, and orders to the judges require them to appoint guarantors for the appearance of the impressed men. Sometimes the name of a single bailsman appears against the name of the oarsman, sometimes a group, and sometimes all the inhabitants of the village/quarter. These guarantors pledged their persons, property, or both. Once the levy was complete, the judge sent the men under guard to the arsenal, or to whatever point they were to meet the ships. With them, he sent a register, which enabled the receiving authorities to check that all of them had arrived. For the oarsmen, the journey to the coast must have caused almost as much hardship as service in the fleet. All districts in Turkey and the Balkan Peninsula were liable for the levy, and not simply those that were close to the embarkation points, requiring the men to travel on foot from as far away as Albania or central Anatolia to Istanbul or other coastal sites. To man, for example, the fleet which was to besiege Chios in 1566, the treasury called up oarsmen from the provinces of Anatolia, Karaman and Rum in Turkey, from the districts of Albania, Epirus and Thrace in Rumelia, and from the islands and Sanyaks in southern Greece that belonged to the province of the archipelago. These were oarsmen for the imperial fleet. The smaller squadrons in Egypt and elsewhere raised their complements locally. 67. In the 17th century, the system for levying oarsmen remained essentially the same as it had been in the 16th. In one respect, however, it had become more systematic. From shortly after 1600, tax registers begin to show exactly which households in which Sanyaks were liable for the levy. Most of these were in western and west-central Turkey. A register of 1640, for example, shows 62,946 households, producing 6,634 oarsmen. This indicates that 1 household in every 9 had to supply a man, with the remainder paying a tax to cover his wages and maintenance. The total number was enough to man 40 or more galleys. This system, was clearly suitable for the first half of the 17th century, a period when there were no large-scale naval expeditions and the annual needs of the fleet did not vary much. However, with the outbreak of the Cretan War in 1645, the demands of the fleet increased, and the government again began, as it had done in the 16th century, to levy oarsmen in central Anatolia and Rumelia. It also introduced an entirely new measure. From 1646, it began to raise oarsmen from Istanbul tradesmen, tavern keepers, keepers of boza, shops, porters and watermen, and from the city's Greeks, Armenians and Jews. For this service they received exemptions from other war taxes. Apart from the watermen, these people did not have to serve in person. They had instead to raise the money to hire the oarsmen and to deliver them to the arsenal, or else to pay a fine in lieu. In 1646, they raised 337 oarsmen. In 1656-7, after the disaster at the Dardanelles, 2,108.68. Most of the oarsmen in the fleet were from the levy but, presumably from earliest times, there were alternative methods of recruitment. One way was to seek volunteers. References to these are few, but commands to the judges of Izmit, Silivri and Zlatitsa from between 1571 and 1574 order them to hire oarsmen for 901,000 akshas, and in 1585, arsenal accounts record 1,139 oarsmen hired for 900 akshas and 2,475 for 1,000. These numbers, if they do represent volunteers, are large and probably very unusual, since volunteers do not seem to have appeared again in any numbers until the Cretan War. 69. Convicted criminals provided a more steady supply of oarsmen. 70. There was no legislation determining what offenses were punishable by the galleys. Decrees drafting criminals onto the ships state merely that the men should be, for example, criminal and seditious or guilty of a grave offense, but not meriting capital punishment and oppos. It is quite clear, in fact, that the criterion for inflicting this punishment was the needs of the fleet at any one time. In 1571-2, for example, after the Battle of Lepanto, judges from every part of the empire, from as far west as Buda to as far east as Van and Erzurum, received commands to send to the galleys in Istanbul all the prisoners in their districts, and all criminals arrested after the receipt of the command. 71 in 1648 and 1651, during the Cretan War, there were transfers of prisoners from the dungeon of Istanbul to the arsenal. 72 prisoners, too, seem to have made up a large proportion of the oarsmen and local flotillas. It was, therefore, the circumstances of the empire rather than the nature of the crime that led to punishment in the galleys. It was, however, the crime that determined the length of the sentence. The most serious offenses were punishable by life, but for other offenses, the oarsman, if he survived, gained his release after a minimum of 6 months. Since the arsenal retained a copy of the entry in the judge's register relating to the accused, and issued a receipt to the man who delivered him, it was possible to keep track of the criminals in the galleys, and of how long they had served. 73. Finally, prisoners of war were another source of manpower, but there appear to be no records of their numbers. It is clear, however, that most of the oarsmen came from within the empire's borders.